10. War. The form of Ektal's centurion Kalshak leaned in close to where he lay upon the bed, the wound in his torn throat having drained his face of any color. It was now almost marble, so alien to how it had been that fateful morning in Eztlan as he guided Ichtak through the morass of urban warfare. The officer reached out, his brows furrowed over milky eyes, looking perturbed at his inability to form words. His spectral hand, cold through the thin blanket upon his chest, pressed down firm, begging his attention, desperate for recognition. It was a dream the prince had been through several times. Experience did nothing to lessen the horror as he saw its face loom close through the intervening shadow, which muffled the dark room, looking like a grainy specter out of time with the world around it, a silent film apparition made manifest. Ichtak could not breathe, the weight of its hand upon his chest seeming as real as the bed beneath him. Its drawn lips cracked, its ripped neck hissing as it began to sputter barely comprehensible words. Coward. He tried to shake his head, to protest the condemnation. He could not move. Fraud. Ichtak attempted to make his fingers twitch, his focus on one digit at a time, shifting to the next after each failure. Anything to wake himself from this dream. What glory could you claim if your people could see you now? The voice was coming from the open wound in the thing's throat more than its sluggish lips. He could almost feel the tepid mist of blood issuing on the air from the gaping wound with each strained syllable. Those below can see you hiding in your den, snake. He had a moment to wonder why it was Kalshak, and not some other dead officer or soldier slain in the stinking streets of the Southland. Perhaps it was the noise, the wheezing coughs that had followed him those awful few steps before the sound of the officer's desperately ragged breaths had faded into the tumult of the commons. He scolded himself for letting a dream impact him as it did, but the silent internal scolding did little to curb the weight of Kalshak's icy weight upon his chest. They can see it all. Then a hand brushed his cheek, and he bolted upright, the weight of the imagined Kalshak suddenly gone. Setiawan followed him up, hand coming to his shoulder. His eyes were wide, questioning. He did not ask, though, and Ichtak appreciated that. Timid and reserved as he was with more faces in the mix, the feline had a kind of sixth sense during their time together. Seti always seemed to know when a question would be a bridge too far for him. Ichtak sank back down onto the mattress and exhaled, scrunching his eye against the fading memory of the dead centurion, banishing it for some other, lonelier sleep, and cursing himself for his cowardice as he did so. The liquor and warmth of the night prior had dulled, and with its absence, worry returned. Setiawan came down with him, pressing his body to Ichtak's side, resting his head against his shoulder. "You're all right?" No more, no less. No inquiries for explanations. No probing questions about the tossing and turning he knew must play out during his resting hours. "Yes," said Ichtak. "It was always written in the old Lautani manuscripts that uneasy sleep is the mark of Harakwe's eyes upon you," Setiawan said. "A way to toughen the mind. I'd take it as a compliment." "A very Lautani view," said Ichtak. "I think I'd need to be bleeding to draw his favor." Setiawan flicked him on the nose, a comic retort to the dismissal. Ichtak smiled. "Harakwe is the Lord of War, so that he can be the guarantor of peace," Setiawan told him. "I think the Sholoshaishan view focuses too much on the battles he oversees, and not the order they bring. Ichtak the First wrote that we are to be his sword arm, said Ichtak. It makes sense that the Sholoshaitions would focus on the sword, and not the silence that comes afterward. Setiawan's lips tightened, the feline considering what he had to say carefully.
Ichtak the First was a great leader of soldiers, Setiawan said, but I think his life blinded him to what it meant to live outside of war. Great conquerors like him might not have needed something to come home to, but most people do.
Ichtak listened. Never had he heard a non-Sholoshaitan view of Harakwe's philosophy truly elaborated on by a believer of another kindred.
In the days before the Empire liberated the believers around Estlan on the peninsula, we, or my forebears anyway, had to practice in secret,
Setiawan told him from his perch atop his chest.
But even in secret we had rituals and philosophers all our own. The worshippers of Harakwe there celebrated the mothers and wives that welcomed the soldier home from whatever rebellion or sabotage he'd carried out on the Duumvrat's governors as much as the soldiers. They wrote of artists and poets that eased the sorrows of war as much as the men who had won the day. Healers and priests were just as dangerous to Harakwe's foes as the men that carried his swords.
Setiawan's hand traced lines across his chest, the claw of his Lautani hand cold against the smooth gray skin.
People like us could live without fear, he said. As long as the warrior remained the warrior, the drive which brought him home didn't matter. It was between him and Harakwe.
Setiawan craned his head to look at Ichtak.
That's the Harakwe we know in the Southland. Preserver as well as destroyer.
I like the sound of that, Ichtak said at last. But I feel the reason I like the sound of that is because I fit better into the picture. Because it makes me comfortable. It isn't because the Southland's picture is more correct than the Empire's.
Archetypes have meaning, Setiawan told him. Those old stories wouldn't exist if they didn't carry weight. They wouldn't have sparked the poems and the songs they did if they weren't true.
The same could be said for Ichtak the First's empire, said Ichtak. It would not have conquered so much and spread so far if its ideas didn't carry weight. Why would Harakwe spur Tepeklan to act, rather than the Southlands, if he preferred the southern view to the northern view? Why would he shape the people of the stone in his image, if the felines in the jungle were meant to interpret his word? Setiawan sank back down onto Ichtak's chest, silent for a long moment.
I don't know.
Ichtak ran a hand through the patterned hair atop his head, eye boring into the ceiling above, wondering. I'm not some common officer, Ichtak said. I am to be Tletawani. My life is not mine to do with as I please. The Empire needs heirs, and it needs paragons to lead it. I have accepted that weight. It is a terrifying but inspiring weight to bear. Or at least I told myself I'd accepted it. I even believed I'd accepted it. Then, when the time came to adhere, it was almost as if I didn't remember who I was. I wished with all my will to live up to the mantle I was born and raised to take, only to meet you and second-guess myself. The more entangled I've become, the less able I am to control myself. Silence fell for a long moment.
I'm to blame for that.
No, Ichtak said. What care does Harakwe have if a courtier or lesser nobleman does as his urges demand? You are perfect as you are. Read my letters and see what clumsy, earnest lines I've penned for you there. It's me that's to blame. This whole night has been disastrous. I can't help but think I was born to the wrong house. That I am not strong enough, not disciplined enough to bear the title I'm to carry. That I am a liar, a fraud, telling myself I can and then shoving aside the vow the moment it's tested. That, if Harakwe is capable of such things, I am a mistake. Again silence fell. Again it was Setiawan that broke it.
I won't believe this is all a mistake, though. You don't believe you're a mistake, do you?
I think I do. A clanging shattered the quiet pre-dawn hours of morning as the large bell set into the stone above Ichtak's door sounded, making the both of them jump. Ichtak didn't hesitate, sliding out of bed, waving Setiawan after him. "Quickly," said Ichtak, "into the cart." In a flurry of movement, Ichtak threw on a robe and helped Setiawan slip into his clothes. The bell sounded again as they stumbled out into the foyer and down the steps. Ichtak ensured Seti was comfortably hidden away before, as a third chime sounded, he swept up to the barred doorway, doing his best to look every bit as exhausted as he felt. The door swung wide, and he was suddenly face to face with Ruhualpa. The familiar scarred face was taut with worry, perhaps even fear.
"You are needed in the Hall of Conquests," said Ruhualpa.
The information passed to him by Setiawan was all he could focus on. Such a summons at this hour could mean only one thing. "Who is it? The Latani?"
"Ida. We have to hurry."
"I'll throw on my uniform," said Ichtak. "We'll need to be ready to head north immediately." Ruhualpa nodded, saying, "Be quick." Ichtak swung shut the door. He shot up the stairs and back into his bedroom, preparing in haphazard but record time. Throwing on his boots for the first time since Eztlan, he thumped down the stairs ready for whatever struggle awaited him. Stooping at the cart, he whispered that he would send the Ektal Palace attendants outside in to return the supplies to the medical wards. He was halted when Setiawan pushed open the cart to meet his eye a final time. Ichtak stooped to embrace him. With that, he was gone, sweeping from the room and thundering after Ruhualpa at a near jog, only spending a few words to order the cart's removal as they passed. Invasion alone could make him forget the pain of his bruised leg, and of his bruised soul. He had a keen sort of salience then, a realization that seemed to slice through to the core of him, even as he rushed through the palace halls with a war on the wind. It was, Ichtak thought, as if every time he found himself confronted by his weakness, by his inability to live up to the expectations of his forebears, he slipped into the distraction of exertion and violence. Sometimes these distractions were his own, like his sparring sessions with the Coat, and sometimes, as now, the thrilling terror of war or contests were thrust upon him by fate. These were noble pursuits, but through them he laid aside the memory of that weakness. It was precisely because he did not worry about his defects in action that they stalked back to dominate him in peace. He escaped into ignorance in blood or the sweat of exhaustion, only to collapse into his own facile desire for happiness the moment they were done. He had been happy when Ruhualpa had delivered the news. He was happy even now as he tailed the High Marshal through the corridors in the frenzied dark, the bustle of attendants and officers moving to this or that part of the palace in the furor of a coming conflict roaring all about them. But he was not happy solely because he was eager to be tested in service to his country. It was the glee of the addict, he thought, who, excised from his normal schedule of indulgence, can role-play as a respectable soul under the distraction of obligations, only to collapse into indulgence once more the moment his duties are spent. It was a cruel truth, but it was truth all the same. Setiawan had been nothing but warm to him. As Ichtak had said, he could not blame him. The blame for his capitulation to base desire was his alone. And now, he was free of having to dwell upon it. And despite that clarity, still he buried his worry. Still he buried his shame. Sholosha'idi needed him, as it needed all the sons of Harakwe, and he could not let himself be lost in self-reflection. All he could do was promise that he would reassess himself after the roaring fires of invasion were doused, and he could afford to try and rebuild himself. Ichtak meant to recite a silent prayer for Setiawan's safety, but settled for hope. In the wake of his recurring nightmare and the tumult of thoughts in his head, he felt the underworld could use a relief from his constant nagging for one day. All Sholosha'idi might need what little grace Harakwe could send them very soon. The palace's throne room was flanked by the Hall of Conquests, a huge amphitheater decorated with the captured banners and weaponry of Sholosha'iti's fiercest foes, and centered upon a firelit stone stage upon which the Empire's commanders relayed their reports to the monarch. The prince found the room largely vacant, playing host only to several highly ranked Ektal, Navy, Air Force, and Imperial Army officers who sat alongside Queen Tlali of Kushkotlan. Her face was pale, and her tired eyes were haunted with an anxiety rare among the nobility of so indomitable an empire. Equally discombobulated but far more visibly agitated, the towering, uniformed figure of Prince Thunkoat loomed beside her. Over all these figures presided the Tlatoani herself, imperious as ever, tapping her long fingers upon the arms of her seat at the crest of the amphitheater. Despite the small crowd, she was veiled, ready to dispense her rule to the Council of Harakwe. Even seated, she looked dangerous, giving off the air of an old wolf befuddled by the escape of easy prey. Tlatoani Izel II was not a woman prone to surprise. Upon hearing of the death of her husband in battle during the last Laut Sholosha'ishan War, she had barely blinked. Mental preparations had been made long in advance in the eventuality that just such a loss would thrust the full weight of a global empire upon her shoulders. When the weight found her, she had refused to buckle. She had kept that empire aloft and watched it thrive, navigating each unexpected twist of the path towards her nation's betterment with a cunning she devoutly believed made Harakwe below proud. This morning, Ichtak noted that, despite her reputation, she seemed just as surprised as her company. "There is no question," the Tlatoani assured Queen Tlali. "The Empire must mobilize. We must marshal more men than we have seen marshaled since the end of the last Laut Sholosha'ishan War. We must remind the northern savages that they lost the right to set foot in this land long ago. But it was not the sons of the winged serpent that brought this tragedy to our doorstep," she continued, her eyes drifting to the ceiling as if they might divine the will of Harakwe's skyborn antithesis through the stone. Her fingers still played aimlessly, doing what little they could to relieve the storm brewing within her. "Our foe is dull, a blunted hammer. If it is not intellect that makes it so, then superstition makes up the distance. The Ida are not meddlers and connivers." "The garrison in Kushkotlan expects as much, Your Majesty," said Ruhualpa. "We all do. I have Ektal rangers in Kushkotlan slipping over the northern border to dig up what they can even now. But this is not the time. We can answer our questions after we've filled the canyons outside Kushkotlan with dead lizards. I'll grant your request to place my son in command of the Ektal legions sent north to relieve the city," said the Tlatoani. "Prince Thunkoat will have command of all army or Ektal legions still in Kushkotlan once he has arrived home. The two of them will have the best of our officers in their ears to advise them on the warpath, as always. This is your task.
I will be here, watching from afar," she said with a wave of her hand about the hall. "I have a great deal of time to sniff out who is to blame for this. I can promise you, I will succeed." Ruhualpa saluted in the imperial style, his head dipping in acceptance of her words. He wheeled to go, and Ichtak fast saluted in kind, ready to depart alongside him. "Ichtak," the Tlatoani called, halting him in his tracks. It was so very rare for her to use his name. "Yes, Your Majesty." "When you marched for Estlan, I had intended for you to avoid the front," she said, "to preserve your safety. You went against that wish, with Ruhualpa's help along the way." Ichtak stayed silent. Ruhualpa, frozen in kind off to his side, followed suit. "Now the Empire murmurs your name," she told him. "The old general below made flesh above, they say. The one-eyed god's favored son. They are right to whisper these things." She rose, stalking down the steps of the amphitheater to join them where they stood along the edge of the stage. "These are not rebel militiamen or rival flower warriors. We face the despoilers, they who once lived above these very stones, paying homage to Harakwe's greatest foe, while we toiled in the deeps beneath them. They are our oldest and darkest foes. You will be at the forefront, stuck in the thickest of the fighting, bleeding with the soldiery." She drew in close, holding Ichtak's eye with her own gaze, letting him see a glimpse of something which just might be described as pride. Later, in reflection, he would conclude that it could have been nothing else. But in the flesh of that moment before her, haunted by the scene he'd fled just minutes before to talk of hallowed war, Ichtak felt as much shame as he did warm acceptance. "You are the avatar of Harakwe in this moment," she said. "Whether it be alive or dead, return home victorious." Despite their phrasing as an order, there was no trace of doubt in the words. "Of course, Your Majesty." Ichtak saluted once more. Izel smiled, the expression visible only as a softening of her eyes above her veiled muzzle, and dismissed him.